indispensable for science. I think that the book Cuban Privilege is deficient as social science. And I think that it's deficient as social science because it has an ideological bias, and this ideological bias leads to not being able to prove in that book convincingly that Cubans did not face persecution or well-grounded fear of persecution.
Yes!
I appreciate Dr. Eckstein has been scrupulous in her respect of time. Please let me get through this because I have 15 minutes and I have a lot to say. And I don't want to speak really fast because then you lose me if you won't understand what I'm saying. I believe that Dr. Eckstein's ideological bias is described repeatedly by her in the book. I have many quotations, but I'm going to summarize it as this. It is her belief that the regime in Cuba is an anti-imperialist force which, although somewhat repressive, embodies Cuban national self-determination. She also believes and states that the Castro regime was inspired by high altruistic values. In the Q&A, I can read you the quote.
No.
Both of these statements, to me, are historically and empirically difficult to prove. I think they're wrong. Just now, Dr. Eckstein stated that at the beginning, the Castro regime was not communist. To state that is another axiomatic declaration of a truth which is not grounded in history. For example, to believe that Castro was not a communist from the beginning, you'd have to contradict Castro himself. He spent the rest of his life saying that he had been a communist all along, from his university days. Second of all, you'd have to dismiss the human structure around him and the forces that brought him to power and created the ruling clique of that new regime. You'd have to ignore the regime practices from day one. You'd have to ignore how he radicalized the agrarian reform to create the first totalitarian institution, the National Institute for Agrarian Reform. I can go on and on. But you can't easily just affirm that the regime wasn't communist from the beginning without taking that into account. And I believe that this mistaken belief in what the regime was and what it's always been is exemplified by the fact that in her book, Dr. Eckstein never refers to the regime as totalitarian. Only once, and that's in quoting from a US bill, I believe a US law. The regime being totalitarian is widely recognized in political theory. Juan Linz himself, who's one of the key authorities in describing regimes, concluded Cuba is a totalitarian regime. But for the effects of what we're discussing now, not understanding that we're dealing with a totalitarian regime in Cuba prevents you from correctly assessing whether Cubans, exiled Cubans, faced persecution or had well-grounded fears of persecution. You would have to ignore, and I found very little, if any, mention of any of this in Dr. Eckstein's presentation, the massacres carried out by the regime from day one, the extrajudicial killings, the number of mass executions, the number of political prisoners and detainees per capita in Cuba, the number of people interned in concentration camps, no mention of the UMAP, in the entire book. The campesino insurgency, the civil war in the countryside, the collapse in food production caused by the madness of the agrarian reform as the regime carried out, and the campesino insurgency. The captive towns, pueblos cautivos, hundreds of families were forcibly relocated in Cuba to different provinces and not allowed to leave those towns for decades. The massive historical scope of acts of repudiation. The acts of repudiation began in 1959. Dr. Eckstein does mention the acts of repudiation, the ones in 1980. She describes a great deal of their horror, but she says it's a low point in the history of the revolution. No, it was there from the beginning. The use of mobs, mass formation, as it's called, was an instrument of the regime to consolidate totalitarian power from the get-go, and it's a standard practice of all totalitarian regimes. If you do not take any of this into account, if you do not take into account the reality of per capita repression, if you disregard the abundant literature on the scale of mass repression in Cuba, as Professor Eckstein, in this book at least, has done, only then can you arrive at the conclusion that Cuban exiles, as the US government definition of refugee states, were not either persecuted or had founded fear of persecution. But if I don't look at any of that, if I don't mention that, then I will arrive at a conclusion that is not accurate. Because these are real factors. They occurred in time. Furthermore, Dr. Eckstein doesn't account for the fact that when you asked to leave Cuba legally, that marked you, and you were punished. Leaving Cuba legally was a difficult process because there was repression once you asked to leave. I know it firsthand. My parents lived it. They spent 5 years trying to get out of Cuba. And additionally, it doesn't take into account that if you try to leave Cuba illegally, you could be killed, as many were, or you could be in prison for years. What about the lancheros, the boat people? Thousands of young men and women, entire families who spent years in prison because they tried to leave illegally. So just wanting to leave was taken by the regime as opposition to the regime. Not understanding the regime was totalitarian, dismissing the speeches by Guevara, by Castro, from the very beginning, dismissing the laws, they're not mentioned in the book, the repressive laws on mass scale, which the regime has been implementing to this very day, is to ignore the fact that the purpose of the regime, with or without US acquiescence, was to create a totalitarian structure, was to transform Cuban society, to destroy a society that had existed and create something new. This regime has not been a defender of national self-determination. What's more, how can the people freely self-determine themselves if they have no freedom of speech, if they have no freedom of the press, if there's no freedom of association, if there's no multi-party political elections, if social organizations have to accept regime-imposed leadership, and on and on and on. Ignoring all this perhaps leads Dr. Eckstein to state over and over again in her book that the opposition of the Cuban middle and upper classes was due to a loss of lifestyle and not to a fear of persecution. No, that's not true. That's not true because, and there's something else she never mentions in the book, natural rights, natural liberties are a core value of Cuban culture. Cuba experienced bloody wars of independence to achieve not an ethno-state, not a totalitarian state, but to achieve a free republic founded on individual freedoms. That's been a fundamental mainstay of Cuban culture since our national identity was born. And those freedoms and those liberties, by any measure you can apply, were being violently repressed and eliminated by this regime from the very beginning and continue to do so to this very day. A regime that had promised free elections within 18 months had, by the end of 1960, confiscated all private media. That includes 58 daily newspapers, 160 radio stations, and 23 TV stations. And that leads me to another point. I don't know if it's because of the ideological bias, but Dr. Eckstein ignores the realities of pre-Castro Cuba. And she often falls into these sweeping generalizations that ignore what was happening in Cuba and how advanced Cuba was and what the Cubans had accomplished between 1902 and 1959. I can get into that later because I have more statistics on them. As a result, Professor Eckstein continuously classifies opposition to the regime as founded on petty selfish reasons and not on the desire to recuperate fundamental freedoms and out of love for the ideal of a republic in Cuba. An ideological totalitarian regime had taken power. This regime believed in national self-determination and national sovereignty only when it was convenient for it, and it trampled and has trampled the principle of self-determination from 1959 to today. A few examples. Their support for the Russian aggression against Ukraine, active support for the invasion of a small country by a larger country, the support for the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which split the international non-aligned movement, the 1968 support for the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. No belief in national self-determination, only belief in what was convenient for the ideological totalitarian state. So if you dismiss these overriding and profound reasons for opposition to the regime. If you dismiss and you don't take into account the organized and planned mass scale of repression in Cuba, then you don't understand what Cubans feared, why Cubans were leaving, and the grounded belief that anyone could be the victim of repression, and that's what you felt in Cuba. And what you felt in Cuba throughout all these decades. Anyone can fall, anyone can be arrested. If you're a hippie, if you're a homosexual, if you're a writer, if you're an inconformist, if you want to leave, if you're Baptist, if you're Catholic, whatever it is, you can be picked up and disappear. And that's been the rule of this regime. And that truth cannot be denied. What the United States faced in 1959, due to its own bungling of Cuba policy, was the unimaginable consolidation of a totalitarian state in the heart of the Western Hemisphere. You didn't need Eisenhower and Kennedy took Cubans to come. They were fleeing because of the massive repression Cuba was experiencing. And a repression not seen in Cuba since the days of the wars of independence in the 19th century. And since the United States, for whatever reasons, took the decision not to support active regime change in Cuba, not to seek the change of the regime through decisive means. Since the U.S. agreed with the Soviets in the 1962 Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement not to invade Cuba, the U.S. knew that change was not coming. And they also knew, and under the shadow of the guilt of the Bay of Pigs and the Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement, they also knew that not allowing these Cubans in would be tantamount to a human catastrophe. Thank God the U.S. took us in. Thank God other countries took us in. My bias is I lived through all this. When Dr. Eckstein talks about fake tourists jumping from country to country to find a way in, that was my parents and me. Cuba, Spain, Nicaragua, and then finally the U.S. We were a stateless people. People were deported from Cuba. The priests deported on the nuns deported on the ship without travel documents. They had nowhere to go. They had no passports. Who was going to accept them? And this practice of deporting people without passports was continuous. To this day, there are people barred from returning to Cuba. Thousands of Cubans are not allowed back in by the regime. And that's another very important point. When you left Cuba, the regime did not allow return. Leaving Cuba meant you lost your homeland, you lost your family. The telephone calls from Cuba were extremely difficult. And when you finally got a call, you had an operator listening in on what you were talking about with your family. And the operator would interfere if they felt the conversation was counter-revolutionary. How many of us remember that? I remember it very well. Not only that, if you received letters from your family abroad, or you wrote to your family abroad, you could not progress in the regime. They blocked you in your professional development, in your social development, in your friendships. Everything was blocked by the regime if you decided to maintain contact with your family outside the country. I have numerous examples of that being applied, of that kind of repression being applied. And repression was not only active, it was passive. Just by sitting in your house, you had a block committee watching over you and supervising what you were doing. Privacy was lost. And that was the purpose of what the regime was doing, transforming, forcing people to accept totalitarianism. I think that this bias leads Dr. Eckstein's work to establish double standards that undermine its objectivity. There are many that I can list, but there's one that really bothers me. And I'm going to say what it is. There's two that bother me, I'm going to emphasize one. In Dr. Eckstein's book, she describes Jorge Mascanosa as an influence peddler. Why not a lobbyist? Why not an advocate? Why does he have to be described as an influence peddler? What was Jorge Mascanosa's crime? Fighting for free Cuba? Yep. Being a successful businessman? Not forgetting a free Cuba even when he had everything he could dream of here in the U.S.? Yep. That love of Cuba has characterized our community. We didn't leave because of country clubs. We didn't leave because of losing schools. We left because our land was repressed. And once we had a lot again here, we kept on thinking about Cuba, loving Cuba, and supporting Cubans every way we can. Amen. I hope it's a mistake, I hope it's an error. This is, and once I explain this, I'm going to finish because my time's running out. Dr. Eckstein, and to me this is very serious, makes a reference to the Cuban American National Foundation and drug dealing. I'm quoting, within a decade, the foundation came to claim 50,000 members with some 170 directors, trustees, and associates who amassed fortunes in the United States, contributing $1,000 to $10,000 to the organization annually. Some of them, I'm quoting, I'm reading this, repeatedly acquiring their wealth in drug trafficking, with Miami at that time becoming a hub. Dr. Eckstein's footnote referred me to the Cuban Information Archives. It's a great source of information on Cuba. When I went there to the Cuban Information Archive, I found a list, I think it's over 100 foundation directors, trustees, and part of the leadership council. I didn't find any reference to drug trafficking in that website I was directed to by the footnote. Then the footnote also refers to a book titled Cocaine Politics, a book from 1992, to pages 24 to 35 and pages 117 to 26. 3 times I went over the pages in that book. Those pages referred. I didn't find a single name of any foundation director or trustee listed as a drug trafficker in those pages. The author makes a series of allegations against people he describes as Cuban exiles being involved in drug trafficking, linking it up with the Contra resistance. It doesn't refer to indictments. It doesn't refer to arrests. I think this is unethical. I think if this is not a mistake, linking prominent people in this community who worked very hard to achieve what they did with allegations of drug trafficking, and then not showing us where those names are listed as drug traffickers, indictments, convictions, I don't think it's right. I don't think that agrees with science or with scholarly work, and it is a major issue for us. Because certainly we suffered from Cuban drug traffickers. Of course we did. The whole world has suffered from drug traffickers. But no one ever mentions that it was Cuban American cops and FBI agents who brought those drug traffickers down. And I'm very proud of them because they're the unsung heroes of our community. So, I want to finish by saying that this compendium of things prevents Dr. Eckstein from better understanding our community, what we're about, what we stand for, why we function as we function, and why we keep on dreaming of a free Cuba. Thank you very much.
Bravo!